Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Again, my name's Kevin Andre. I'm the Superintendent of Northern Gateway Public Schools and part of the Alberta Royal Education Symposium Planning Committee. And we're really thrilled to have you all here this evening for our guest speaker. But before we move on with that, I want to take a moment to actually thank the staff of the Fantasyland Hotel for what was a wonderful meal. Thank you very much. This evening we're joined by a very special guest who is really highly sought after, not just within the province of Alberta but beyond, to speak to a number of very interesting topics, largely tied to economics. Born in Edmonton, Alberta, Todd Hirsch holds a BA Honours in Economics from the U of A and an MA in Economics from the University of Calgary. For over 20 years, he's worked as an economist at the Canadian Pacific Railway, the Canada West Foundation, and the Bank of Canada. For almost a decade, Todd has taught economics at the U of C. He released his first book, The Boiling Frog Dilemma, Saving Canada from Economic Decline, in 2012. Since then, he wrote a more personal missive, Halfway Home, 50 Years in 50 Chapters, a little bit more personal if you want to know more about Todd. Very interesting fellow. And, special announcement, Todd just informed us at the dinner table that his third work, Spiders in Space, Successfully Adapting to Unwanted Change, book written by himself and Rob Roach, is just coming out in the very near future, and I'll leave that for Todd to speak to later on this evening. Todd provides economic commentary for several Canadian media outlets, and you may have heard him on the radio or read his column in the Globe and Mail. He currently serves on the U of C Board of Governors and is the chair of the Calgary Arts Academy. He recently received the U of A's Alumni Honor Award. He writes an economic update that is sent to thousands of subscribers around the world every day. It's called The Owl, and you can subscribe it just by Googling it online. In April of 2016, Todd was highlighted in the Alberta Venture magazine, which profiles high-profile Albertans and the things that they've done over their lives. So I garnered a few interesting facts about Todd at that point. One is that he did his thesis on where oil and gas companies choose to locate their head offices and why. It's riveting stuff. I recommend you get to it and read that. On consecutive days in 2011, Todd spoke to a business audience in Vancouver and then to farmers in the basement of the Freemasons Hall in Fort Macleod. He puts about 1,000 kilometers on his vehicle each week. In fact, he drove up today, I think, from Calgary. He's got 7 engagements this week that will take him both up and down between Calgary, Edmonton. He is off to Winnipeg in the middle, and he's always well sought after. One quote: "You have to find a pretty small place in Alberta to find one that he hasn't been to," and it's true. He's in Whitecourt just last week, and you know how big Whitecourt is. A couple of other key quotes: Todd spends the bulk of his time sharing the story of Alberta's economy in clear-eyed and energetic talks across the province and the rest of the country. He demystifies wealth and the economy, and he answers vital questions like what's the state of Alberta's economy, how does it impact the individual, and what's in store for the future. I'm looking forward to a really engaging talk with Todd. He has agreed to take questions at the end of his presentation. And without further ado, please welcome our guest speaker, Todd Hirsch.
Knock it out, Todd. Thank you, sir. Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. That was altogether too kind. I'm delighted to be here this evening with you back in my hometown. I did grow up here in Edmonton, and a lot of you should know that I am a proud product of Alberta's public education system. I did everything from, From all the way from kindergarten, all the way to my master's degree here in Alberta. Some of it in rural Alberta, in Camrose and Wetaskiwin. I spent any Camrose or Wetaskiwin people? Yeah, oh, there they are, yes. And did high school here in Edmonton in the public system. So I commend all of you for the work that you do in educating our young people. And I'm on record in several things that I've written or spoken on in the past. There is no more important investment we can make as a province than in education. Like, it's hands down, there's not even a question. The prosperity of our country and our province depends on our educated young people. So the work that you are all doing, probably as educators or as administrators in the boards, so important, and I commend all of you for all your great work. The title of my presentation this evening, is it going to come up here? Where's the, oh no, there we go, okay. I was one ahead. The title of the presentation that I have for you this evening, Rebuilding Alberta's Economy, an Alberta Economic Outlook for the winter and spring. I guess we can start talking about spring. It doesn't feel very spring-like today, but we're close, of 2017. I think it's fair to say that this is the way a lot of Albertans have felt their economy has treated them over the last couple of years. There has been a feeling that everything collapsed in on them and for some people, very suddenly. Going back to 2014, just prior to the oil price downturn, right around this time of year, 3 years ago, Alberta was the clear economic engine of Canada's economy, the lowest unemployment rate in the nation, fastest growing economy and labor market, highest wages. But then very suddenly in the second half of 2014 and into 2015, we slid into a recession. And the recession grinded on for 2 full years. Now, it's not unusual, in fact, for Alberta to experience a recession. In fact, over the last 40 years, we've seen a downturn in this province on average about every 6 or 7 years. Not often spaced out evenly, but on average about every 6 or 7 years. What is unusual, however, is to have 2 consecutive years of contraction. And that is what we've just come through in 2015 and 2016. So you do have to go back to the 1980s to find something as severe as what we've just come through. And for many of you, perhaps a lot of you in this room who maybe weren't in Alberta in the 80s, maybe some of you too young to remember Alberta in the 1980s, what we just came through in 15 and 16, this will, for this generation, mark that moment where people will talk about, remember the downturn of the mid-teen years. Now, I think we are coming out of recession. What I want to do this evening is talk a little bit about where we were, where we are currently, and some suggestions about what's coming up next. Sometimes when you look back on things, we look now back on 2015 and 2016, sometimes you can see, hindsight is a great teacher, and sometimes it's possible to see in advance bad things happening. This bad idea in progress here, like this guy. Now, I'm not a kinesiologist. I don't know all that much about proper exercise technique, but this looks like a really bad idea for this guy. And when it goes badly for him, I hope he has the chance to go back and review the tapes and maybe do a few things differently. Sometimes, however, we're not afforded the ability to see what might be coming ahead of us, like the forest fires in Fort McMurray last May, that were devastating to that community and indeed the whole province, and is still being felt today. So sometimes hindsight is a good teacher. Sometimes events are just completely unpredictable and difficult to plan around. But coming out of the recession, now we are looking forward in Alberta to 2017 and beyond. So where are we at now? What I've done is identified 5, aspects or components of Alberta's economy, which I'll go through in order, and again, talk about where we're at and where I think things are going to go in the coming years. Let's start, first of all, with the job market, employment, because it is always around employment. This is where, for good reason, this is where people become quite emotional and quite personally affected by a downturn. Nobody lies awake at night tossing and turning, worried about the wholesale trade report or manufacturing shipments or some crazy thing. But we will lie awake at night in anxiety about our jobs. Am I going to have a job tomorrow? Am I going to be able to find work? Are your kids coming out of school going to be able to find work? Or are they going to have to move to another province? So employment is very emotional and very personal for people. What I've done is created an infographic to compare Alberta's job market 3 years ago to where we are today. And what I've done for each sector of the economy, I've constructed a colored box. The width of the box will represent average weekly earnings in that sector. The depth of the box will represent the number of people employed in that sector. So it's not just one or the other, but it's the area of the box, wages multiplied by employment. It's the size of the box that is going to matter. And then what I've done is I've stacked these boxes up in decreasing order of average weekly earnings to create this employment tree. This will make a little more sense once I start stacking them up. For the reference point, we're starting at the 12-month period that straddles late 2013 and the first half of 2014. And that period particularly, about 3 years ago, because that represents the high watermark for Alberta and our economy. Record number of people employed, record high average weekly earnings, a near record unemployment rate, or low unemployment rate. So this is the point in time. This is as good as it got. And then we're going to compare it to where we're at today. So 2013, 2014, let's start stacking up those sectors. At the very bottom, in other words, the highest weekly earnings, no surprise, the oil and gas sector. That dark red box, you see it very, very wide, representing wages. Wages in Alberta's oil and gas sector are not only the highest in the province, they are by far the highest in the country. On average, more than twice as high as wages across all sectors in Canada. But you notice that box actually isn't all that deep. In other words, direct employment in oil and gas in Alberta, it's not the largest sector. Many, many more industries are indirectly affected by petroleum. But the oil and gas sector itself, direct employment, it's actually not the deepest box, but it is very, very wide. On top of that, second highest average weekly earnings, the construction sector. There you see a big drop in wages, in fact, but the box is almost twice as deep. Almost twice as many people work in the construction sector as they do in oil and gas. And then we start stacking them up. Professional, scientific, and technical. These would be things like doctors and lawyers and accountants and geologists and geophysicists and engineers. Anybody that has a professional designation behind their name. On top of that, wholesale trade, public administration, manufacturing, transportation and warehousing, education, healthcare, retail, and at the very top, accommodation and food. And then at the very bottom, there's about 11 other sectors that, just to keep the graphic a little cleaner or neater, I've just lumped them all together in the all other category. But you see as we rise up the tree, those blue and purple sectors nearer the top, wages are smaller in them, especially retail and accommodation and food, mostly because of the predominance of part-time positions in retail and food and accommodation, but also the fact that there's a lot of entry-level positions. I bet if I surveyed the room, a high percentage of us, our first job was either in retail or food and accommodation. That's where a lot of people tend to find their first job experiences. So a lot of entry-level positions, a lot of part-time positions. You see that wages there are far less, average weekly wages. But you also notice those boxes are quite deep. In other words, a lot of people employed in healthcare, retail, and accommodation and food. Far more, in fact, than are directly employed in oil and gas. So that's what the employment tree looked like 3 years ago. What does it look like today? Well, here's what it looks like currently. Now, your reaction might be to say, well, it hasn't really changed shape at all. And it hasn't fundamentally, but there are 4 sectors that have changed. 4 sectors of this tree have been responsible for all of the jobs lost in Alberta. Almost all of the jobs shed in Alberta. Some of those sectors are even a little bit deeper. In other words, they've added jobs. But 4 sectors are responsible for virtually all of the jobs lost. What are the 4 sectors? Number 1, oil and gas, down 23% in employment from 3 years ago. But you might also notice that wages in oil and gas sector haven't changed. In other words, that box is just as broad today. In fact, average weekly earnings are even a little bit higher today in oil and gas than they were 3 years ago. The way Alberta's petroleum sector has dealt with the downturns in getting their costs down has not been to shrink paychecks, but to eliminate headcount. So it is down 23% in employment. The second sector, the construction sector, down 11%. The third one, professional, scientific, and technical, down 9%. You can start to see a trend emerging here. And the fourth sector that has been responsible for a lot of lost jobs, manufacturing, down 11% in employment. Now, you don't need to have a Nobel Prize in economics to understand the problem Alberta has experienced. Disproportionately, the jobs that have been shed over the last 3 years have been in the highest paying occupations and the highest paying sectors. And this is, in fact, why Alberta has experienced a nasty recession. And this, by the way, is unlike the recession of 2009, where if we did the comparison there, you would see a much more uniform job loss across a variety of sectors. This downturn, because it was an energy sector downturn, they are concentrated in those high-paid occupations. And that's also, by the way, another reason why Calgary has been hit disproportionately harder by this downturn than Edmonton. So when you look at total employment, which is the height of the tree, it is down. Employment's down about 3.7% compared to 3 years ago. But that isn't really the full story. In fact, it's not really the best indicator of the change in the labor market. Yes, we have lost jobs, but it's not the height of the tree that's important, it's the area of the tree. Employment multiplied by wages in those respective sectors, and the area of the tree, total wages in the province, are down almost 6% from where they were 3 years ago. This is, I think, a more accurate description of how Alberta's job market has changed, and in fact why the province has experienced such a severe recession. 2 years of contraction. I'm going to save some of my comments for the end about where I think the job market is going to go in 2017 and beyond. But for now, I hope that offers a nice visual description of how Alberta's job market has changed. All right, let's talk about the petroleum sector particularly, because as I said in the last slide, there's not tremendous number of people that actually work directly in oil and gas, but there are many, many more people who are indirectly influenced by what happens in the petroleum sector. In fact, you have to look pretty hard in this province to find somebody who is in no way affected by the price of oil. A few years ago, and this might resonate with a lot of you, a few years ago, I was chatting with a friend of mine. She was a school teacher here in Edmonton, and she made sort of a comment that she was glad that, she didn't work in the oil and gas sector and didn't have to worry about oil prices. And I thought, well, as someone who works in, as a school teacher, you might want to go back and review how public finance in this province works, because you are very much influenced by what happens, your job is, by what happens with energy prices, of course, because how dependent our provincial government is on royalties from oil and gas. But where is the oil and gas sector going? What are prices going to do in 2017? Well, it really was the only single economic change in this province when oil went from $107 a barrel all the way down to $27 a barrel, a little bit more than a year ago, and now they've recovered. That is the single, recovered somewhat, that is the single change, economic change, that has pushed this province into 2 years of contraction. So it really underscores how dependent this province remains on the oil and gas sector, and in this case, oil particularly. But where are oil prices going in 2017? Well, first of all, we have to stop saying never. We can't say it will never be at $90, it will never be at $25. We get into trouble once we start saying, well, this could never happen, or that could never happen, or this guy could never be elected president of the United States. Like, anytime you start to say never, you're going to find yourself possibly trapped because you discounted the possibility of that happening. Oil, a year from now, oil could be at 25, it could be at 90. I don't think those extremes are very likely, but they are possible. What I think is the most likely scenario is that oil is going to continue to trade between the $50 and $60 mark. And here we're using the US dollar West Texas Intermediate benchmark price. Between 50 and 60, actually pretty close to where we've seen it trending for the last 4 or 5 months. There's been a remarkable stability, in fact, with oil prices since about November, global oil prices. And I think markets and commodity traders, they found a new level of comfort with WTI trading between 50 and 55. And barring any kind of unforeseen development of some sort or other, and we can't discount those too much, but barring anything really extraordinary, I think we will continue to see oil trade between 50 and 60. I don't think it has too much chance of getting above 60, at least not on a sustained basis. And that's because of all the shale oil in the United States. There is a lot of oil in the US, and the new shale technologies have opened up whole new reservoirs. Some of you might remember, it was just before Christmas time, early December, there was a news story out, if you were listening to the news that day, but I couldn't help but chuckle. They said there was a massive new oil discovery in Texas. And I thought to myself, haven't they already explored every inch of Texas? Like, it's not a new place. But of course, it's not that they never thought to look in this particular spot before. It's that new technologies has opened up brand new reservoirs of shale oil that they couldn't economically get at before. So in that respect, the new technology has actually opened up brand new discoveries of oil. And anytime those oil prices get up to pretty much where they're at now, $55 or certainly $60, that US shale oil comes onto the market in a big way, and it puts a bit of a cap on oil prices, probably around $60 for that US, for the WTI barrel. So I don't think we're going to see oil prices too much above 60. I don't actually think they're going to fall too much down below 50 or 40. I think OPEC has decided that, well, $30 oil wasn't working out so great for them either. This game of chicken that they were playing, pushing all this oil onto the market 2 years ago or even a year ago, trying to weed out their competitors. It was a very effective strategy for a while. The problem is they suffer too from low oil prices. And Saudi Arabia particularly, I think, has come to the realization that, maybe a little bit higher oil price and some stability wouldn't be so bad. So I think that's the scenario we're looking at, oil between 50 and 60. For Alberta, that's good news and bad news. The good news is $55 oil is almost precisely twice as good as $27 oil, about where it was last year. And that increase in oil price and the stability that we've seen over the last few months, that has really gone a long way to stabilize the petroleum sector in this province. I think a lot of producers are greatly relieved, in fact, to see some stability in prices above 50. The challenging news is $50, $55, even $60 oil. It doesn't bring back new growth and investment, particularly in the oil sands. A lot of those oil sand projects, the ones that were on the drawing boards between 2010 and 2014, with all kinds of money and engineering behind them, a lot of those projects required oil at 75 or 80 or even higher. And those projects, they're just not going to go ahead, not anytime soon. So the energy sector now takes on a different role for our economy. With oil between 50 and 60, the energy sector stabilizes. It becomes a backbone of our economy, but it doesn't yet become a growth engine of the economy. And that was the role it was playing between 2010 and 2014, fueling a lot of employment, a lot of capital spending, in some cases driving up wages across other sectors, which was making it difficult for them. But when you have this growth engine called the energy sector, when oil's at 80 or 90 or $100, that's what it does. Going forward, a backbone, a stable factor in Alberta's economy, but not the growth engine that it was previously. I want to talk a little bit about the construction sector in Alberta, because here too there's a little bit of anxiety about what we are in for. Have we built far too much in this province, and are we going to see a big downturn in construction activity in 2017? Well, the best indicator that economists have, we're going to dip into the toy box and pull out the Tonka trucks here. The best indicator that economists have, we call them a leading indicator, sort of a portent of where something is going. For the construction sector, the best indicator we have is building permits. This is a monthly report that comes out, Stats Canada releases it. And you understand this, if a developer or a home builder, if they have a project in mind, the first thing they need to do is secure a building permit for it. And once they have the building permit, then and only then can construction begin. Right now, building permits are in this province, so we're talking over all of Alberta, building permits are down 26% from where they were 2 years ago. And that is a shockingly high number. That is a big drop in construction activity. But I don't think it's the best comparison that you can make. It's one comparison. Where are we now compared to the peak level of activity, the highest rate of construction building we've ever seen in this province? We are down 26%. But I don't think that's the best comparison. Rather, as an economist, I think a better benchmark against which to compare is where are we compared to the 10-year average? Because between 2006 and 2016, this province saw 2 recessions and a lot of boom years in between. We've been up and down the economic cycle a few times in that decade, and I think that is a more appropriate comparison to make. So right now, building permits are down from the 10-year average, but they're down 4%. Well, that is a totally different story than down 26%, right? Down 4% would suggest that 2017, it's going to be a slower year than average, but not a collapse, not a catastrophe. We will see a bigger pullback in some of the commercial building activity, especially in Calgary, where they're looking at 30% vacancy in those nice shiny office towers. So the commercial real estate and the commercial building activity is going to pull back further, but that is going to be offset somewhat by infrastructure projects, public projects, government projects. We'll have to still wait and see the budgets coming out, both provincial and federal government budgets coming out in the next few weeks. We don't have all the details, but the suggestion or the indication is that we will see both levels of government maintaining their capital projects, and that will provide a nice offset. Not a complete offset, but that will provide some partial offset to the pullback that we're going to see in commercial activity. Overall, I would call 2017 for construction a slowdown, but not a disaster. All right, let's talk about a couple of non-energy sectors that actually are doing quite well. And here's where rural Alberta, I think, probably has more skin in the game. There are 2 sectors that I remain very optimistic about for different reasons. The first one, tourism. So we're going to pull out the Barbie Sport Camper, and I know a lot of you had this. So the Barbie Sport Camper to talk about tourism. Whoever thought Barbie would show up in an economics presentation, right? It's just unthinkable. But 2015 for Alberta was a record-setting year for tourism receipts. 2016 was a record year on top of that. And 2017, all signs are pointing to a 3rd consecutive record-setting year. Well, what is it about the current situation that's fueling all this tourism? Well, there might be that. That's a different issue. The staycations, well, that is certainly part of it. The still relatively soft Canadian dollar, around 74, 75 cents. It too has been kind of stable about that range for the last half a year. I don't know if it's going to change too much, but the relatively soft Canadian dollar is going to encourage more staycations, more at-home tourism. It's going to encourage more U.S. visitors. The U.S. economy is back on its feet. They have 4.8% unemployment south of the border. We also have much better and more direct transportation connections with Asia. And I think China still represents a huge, mostly untapped market for Canadian tourism, and maybe Alberta particularly. So there's a lot of things lining up. 2017 is our sesquicentennial year as a country. Lots of parties and events and parades across the province. The national parks are free this year. And by the way, it's just your gate admission. It's not everything in the park that's free. So don't go to the Banff Springs and when you check out say, hey, well, Justin Trudeau said everything is free. It's not going to work. But you see the point. The national parks, there's a lot of things that are working in favor of tourism. I think 2017 is on track for a 3rd consecutive record year. Now, we have to understand, compared to the petroleum industry, tourism is dwarfed by oil and gas. I mean, it's not even close. And I wouldn't want to stand here and leave you with the impression that the increase that we're going to see in tourism is in any way going to offset the downturn in oil and gas or related activities. It's orders of magnitude different. But what I like about tourism, it does represent one of those sectors that actually works in the opposite direction of oil prices. So when oil prices are soft, it usually means the Canadian dollar is soft. It usually means transportation costs, like gasoline, are lower. That actually stimulates tourism. So it kind of works in an opposite direction of the energy sector. And it also does represent a nice piece of economic diversity for this province. And I think everyone understands we have to find new ways to diversify our economy and stimulate new industries. But the other industry that I remain optimistic about is agriculture and agri-foods, more so in rural Alberta, obviously, than in the cities. So we're going to pull out the Fisher-Price family farm. I know a lot of you had that too. I know I did. Agriculture and agri-foods. Now, whenever I'm in rural Alberta, which I was a few weeks ago, I was in, anyone from Pitcher Butte here? Yes, someone's from Pitcher Butte. That's amazing. I was talking to 14 ranchers in Pitcher Butte. Anytime I'm talking to farmers, I have to be very cautious about sounding too upbeat about agriculture, because chances are they're going to haul me in the parking lot later and tell me a thing or two just how miserable it is in agriculture. And in fact, my favorite, this is a little aside, but my favorite story about agriculture, and this is true. 2013, some of you might remember, was a record year for agriculture in Alberta. Crop prices were high, canola prices were at record highs. The crop year was it was a bumper crop. And I was in Three Hills. Anyone from Three Hills? Probably someone. I was in Three Hills talking to one of our ATB agriculture clients, and he was a canola farmer. And it was just past Thanksgiving. He had just brought in his harvest, and I asked him, how are things looking this year? And he was kind of suppressing a smile, I think, and he said, well, not too bad this year. And I thought to myself, for a farmer, that is the best review you're ever going to get. Not too bad. Meaning, of course, it's still bad, but not too bad. I mean, he had hit the jackpot that year. And you know, farming, you don't hit the jackpot every year. And I'm not from a farm family myself, but I'm attached enough and one generation separated from agriculture to understand, I mean, this is an industry not for the timid of spirit. I mean, it takes some resolve to be a farmer. And some years prices are good and some years they're terrible. And some years it's too wet or too dry or too many grasshoppers or something. So it's a difficult industry. Currently, 2017, those prices, cattle prices, wheat and canola prices, they're not at record highs, but they're, I would say, decent. In the livestock sector, the bovine tuberculosis, more so in southern Alberta, is still a real concern. I was in Brooks also a few weeks ago, and they're still very anxious about that development. But the traditional agriculture, wheat, cattle, canola, that makes up about 80% of farm cash receipts. Where I'm more optimistic, in fact, about growth in 2017 is not necessarily the traditional agriculture, although I think it'll be in good shape, but it's more around agri-food and food processing. Very steadily, but quite quietly, food processing in Alberta has surpassed refined petroleum in terms of cash value of shipments. And when you look at the manufacturing sector in Alberta, it was always, the subsectors of it, it was always refined petroleum. That was number one. Well, it's now food processing and food products. Food beverage is now number one, 14 billion in food processing in this province. A lot of that is still the traditional meat packing that goes on, again, more so in the south. But where the growth has been is around a lot of micro niche industries, a lot of cottage industries, small food processors, some of them just working out of their homes, a lot of them selling their products at farmers markets. Now, I think this is a growth trend, I think, that offers a lot of potential to grow into something bigger. Probably a lot of you, like me, like going to farmers markets. And I'm told St. Albert, we have some people here from St. Albert, I'm told St. Albert has Western Canada's largest farmers market. And for that community, it has turned into kind of a major attraction, drawing people in. 30 years ago, you would not really have been able to find a farmer's market, but today you can't find a parking spot at a farmer's market because people are wanting to connect with food in a different way. And this has made all the difference for the small niche food processors. It's not that the small processors in Alberta, it's not that they're managing to meet the economies or match the economies of scale that the big processors in places like Mississauga, you know, the Kraft Canadas or the General Mills, we can't touch them on economies of scale. But what has tilted the balance in favor of the small food processor is changing tastes and preferences among consumers. Because more and more consumers are looking for niche products, locally produced, better quality, better nutritional information, organics in some cases. Again, 30 years ago, you have not seen restaurants going out of their way to promote that this is locally grown produce or local cheese or locally distilled spirits or something like that. And now everyone's tripping over themselves to promote this as local. Probably 30 years ago, and I'm probably not unique, but if someone had said, well, this is local, whatever the product is, I would have thought, well, it couldn't be any good if it's local, That was our mentality. But now in 2017, local has some real cachet around it. Now the product still has to be good. It has to be a world quality product. People aren't going to buy product that's not good. But I think that's the whole point, is that Alberta's small niche food processors have been able to produce not only fantastic products, but they've been able to sort of ride that wave of the premium that comes with, the cachet that comes with a locally sourced product. So lots of optimism, I think, for agri-foods as well. Now again, a jar of organic honey is not going to replace oil in this province as a major driver, but maybe 10,000 new food processors in this province, all of a sudden it starts to present a little bit of a balance, a bit more diversity in our economy, and that's what we need. Finally, I want to talk about some wild cards in Alberta's economy. What are some of those factors that are perhaps a bit unpredictable or uncontrollable? Maybe factors from beyond our borders that could influence what happens here in 2017. Well, we're going to dip into the toy box one more time. We're going to pull out the Avengers action figures, but instead of Captain America and Thor and the others, we have a whole new cast and crew of geopolitical characters this year. Now, I don't know. I'm not a geopolitical scientist. I can't really predict what's going to happen in 2017. But given this cast and crew, the geopolitics of 2017 promise to be very interesting and compelling. Of course, for Canadians, first and foremost, on the top of all of our minds is what's Donald Trump going to tweet out today, And this is the world we live in. Canada, we have a lot at stake with our trade relationship with the United States. I think that the meeting that President Trump had with Prime Minister Trudeau, maybe about 3 weeks ago already, after that meeting, the message that seemed to come out of that was, Canada, don't worry about this. Don't freak out too much about this. It's not you, it's Mexico, that they're really going, or China, or some of their other trading partners. I think Canada will receive better treatment, although we don't know. I mean, Donald Trump is still unpredictable, and unlike other politicians or when a new political party forms a government, there's usually some sort of platform that they've set out that you can kind of use as a guide. If you agree with it or not, there's usually some indication what they're going to do. But with Donald Trump, really all we have is his tweets, and that's pretty hard to go by. The only thing that Donald Trump has been consistent in, and I guess you have to hand it to him for this, he's been very consistent from day one around the idea that he is intending to bring more jobs to America by putting up trade barriers and restricting global trade. He is bringing the U.S. economy more insular. And that message, I think it's wrong-headed, but that message connected with a lot of American voters who really do see Mexico and China as the problem, not other deeper-rooted issues in the United States. They see, cheap televisions coming from China as the problem. So we're going to have to watch and see in Canada what this means. I think our energy sector will be in good shape. I think when President Trump gave his approval on the Keystone XL pipeline, I think that was a very powerful message that said, we understand that this is not America's energy sector over here and Canada's over here, that it is an integrated North American energy system. And in fact, restricting exports of heavy Canadian oil would be absolutely foolish and counterproductive to what they're trying to do. So I think Canada's and Alberta's energy sector can breathe pretty easy. Other sectors, we don't know. Agriculture, forestry, some of those sectors are still walking on some eggshells because they're uncertain how those trade negotiations are going to go with the Americans this year. And then the other cast and crew, Angela Merkel in Europe, she's going to have a fun time of it in Europe this year. Again, I'm not a geopolitical expert, but we saw the Brexit vote last year, whereby the citizens of the UK voted themselves out of the European Union. 2017, in fact, in a few weeks, there are pivotal elections in countries like France, Holland, Italy, and Germany. Other than the UK, those 4 countries, these are kind of the economic powerhouse of Europe. And in all of those countries where there are elections coming, in all of those countries there are strong nationalist, Eurosceptic, populist movements. I don't know if they're going to form governments or win, but the indications are that momentum is in favor. The wind is in the sails of these nationalist, populist parties. And we could see more Brexit votes. We could see more Donald Trumps being elected. Europe could look like a very different place a year from now. And that could affect us here in Canada, simply because Europe, the European Union, is the world's largest economic union and trading bloc. And disruptions to Europe's political fabric would have some impact on financial markets. It would have impact on commodity prices. And of course, that would lap up on the shores here in Canada and in Alberta as well. Finally, I want to end on a story that I think offers a compelling lesson, maybe a lesson that Alberta is going to learn in 2017. The story starts in the 1920s in Cincinnati, Ohio. And at that time, an inventor and entrepreneur by the name of Noah McVicker in Cincinnati, he identified a problem that a lot of American homes were having. A home like this one, in the 20s and 30s, it was popular to use wallpaper to decorate the rooms. The problem is, in the 20s and 30s, a lot of those homes were still being heated with coal furnaces and oil lamps and lanterns. And this was before vinyl wallpaper, so the wallpaper was getting filthy with the soot. And this posed a real problem. It was difficult to wash. But Noah McVicker came up with an innovative product. He mixed boric acid, mineral oil, water, salt, and flour. And he came up with a substance that you could press against the wall, the wallpaper, and peel it off, and it would clean the wallpaper. And it was a hit. Consumers bought this product, and his family-run soap company enjoyed huge commercial success throughout the 20s and 30s with this wallpaper cleaning product. The problem for Noah McVicker came in the 1940s, where a very unwanted development hit him and his family soap company. And that is, more American homes were converting to natural gas, and electricity had all but replaced the oil lamps and lanterns. And as a result, the wallpaper was staying very nice and clean. And because of that, no one was buying his wallpaper cleaning product anymore, and sales started to collapse. And by the mid-1940s, his family-run soap company was almost bankrupt. Fortunately, he had the foresight to bring alongside his company his younger nephew, Joseph McVicker. And that made all the difference. Joseph was able to stand back and look at the problem in a different perspective. And that's sometimes what it takes. Joseph said to his uncle, well, you know, uncle, and I'm paraphrasing, I wasn't there, but he says, you know, this wallpaper cleaning product you've developed, it actually does more than just clean wallpaper. There's other uses for it. The students at the art school are using it as a modeling clay, and children love playing with it, and that was the beginning of Play-Doh. Who knew that Play-Doh, one of the best-selling toys over the last 70 years, actually started out as a failed product, a product that no one was buying anymore in its original use. But it took the younger nephew, Joseph, to be able to step back and look at the product and the problem with a new perspective, and to repurpose or to reimagine what this product could do. Well, what does this have to do with Alberta? I think 2017 for Alberta's economy, we're kind of at our Play-Doh moment in a lot of respects. I don't expect the energy sector to go away. In fact, I think it will remain, as I suggested, the backbone of Alberta's economy. But I think it is requiring Albertans and maybe business leaders and public leaders to step back and also look, well, in addition to hydrocarbons, what else do we do in this province? Are there industries here that we need to develop? Are there industries that we don't even know we have the potential to grow here yet? Sometimes we might be surprised. In fact, I don't think Noah McVicker ever thought he was going to be the inventor of one of the best-selling toys of all time when he set out to clean wallpaper. So sometimes those new perspectives they come in surprising ways, but I think that is the task ahead of Albertans in 2017. So just to wrap up and conclude, it is a rebuilding year for Alberta. We think oil prices are going to remain stable between $50 and $60 a barrel. That stabilizes the petroleum sector, but it doesn't really bring a lot of growth back to the industry, not at those prices. The construction sector is going to slow down, but that's what I would call it, a slowdown, not a collapse. or a disaster. The job market is going to remain weak, and here I've saved some of my comments on the job market for the end. For economists, when we look at labor market indicators, they often lag the economic cycle. And we saw this very clearly coming into the recession back in 2014. When oil prices started to collapse, the job market didn't respond for about 9 months. And that's kind of a predictable pattern for the job market. Employers will hold on and hold on and hold on. No one likes to get rid of people. But at a certain point, they had to. And then we started to see the unemployment rate go from 4.5% to 9%. That pattern coming out of the recession, the labor market is also going to lag. So now that we start to feel more confidence, business sentiment is rising in the province. Almost uniformly across the province, when I travel around, business leaders are saying, yeah, it's turned a corner. We just feel it. The problem is businesses are going to be reluctant to start piling back on a lot of workers. They've just spent 2 years, in some cases, laying them off. They're not going to have the balance sheet or the confidence yet to pile back on a lot of workers. As a result, we think the unemployment rate for the first half of the year is going to remain elevated. Probably uncomfortably high, close to 8.5% or 9%, higher in Calgary than in Edmonton. Rural Alberta unemployment rates are always lower, but that's because job seekers tend to leave rural regions and go to the cities. But across the province, we think we will see a heightened unemployment rate for the first half of the year with gradual improvements, but probably not until the second half of the year or maybe even into 2018. The global wildcards, as we mentioned, Donald Trump and all the others, unpredictable. Who knows what's going to happen, but it will be compelling watching for sure. The non-energy sectors, tourism, agriculture, agri-foods, many others, but those three particularly I've got some optimism for. I think this is where we will see the growth in 2017. And our forecast at the moment, actually I have to update this, we are now forecasting growth of 2.2% for Alberta's economy this year. That's good news in the respect that it ends 2 years of contraction. In 2015 and 2016, those 2 years combined, Alberta's economy contracted about 6 or 6.5%. We're not quite sure of the 2016 numbers yet. But it's like 6 or 7 steps backwards, and now this year, maybe 2.5 steps forward. Doesn't even get us back to the size of economy that we saw in 2014, but it's moving in the right direction. So with that, I will conclude. I want to let you know very quickly about the OWL. Now, this was mentioned in the introduction. The OWL is our daily economic sort of newsletter that comes out each morning. We used to call it the Daily Economic Comment. I know, and I thought, that is the boringest name possible. Who would sign up for something as dull as something called the Daily Economic Comment? It just sounds like vitamin pills or kale or something we're supposed to do, and seriously, no one likes doing it. So we wanted to rebrand it and make it a little friendlier. We call it the OWL. Now here's a trivia question for you. Who knows the significance of the great horned owl to Alberta? It is our majestic provincial bird, the great horned owl. So we thought the owl made a nice symbol for the newsletter, which is subtitled Focused on Alberta's Economy. Comes out every morning, and it's always focused on one new indicator in the province. It takes you 60 seconds to read it. It's nice plain language. It takes a lot longer than that to write it every morning, just so you know what I'm doing at 6:30 in the morning at the kitchen table. But for you, it's a nice, quick, easy read. We don't want to burden people with 10 or 20 minutes of reading that they're not going to do. So it's a quick 60-second dose. If you're interested, it's entirely free. You can go to atb.com/economics to sign up for it. My website and Twitter handle for the social media users. And on that note, I do want to mention what I'm not supposed to be talking about yet. Aha, and that is my new book. My co-author and I, Rob, he was also the co-author of The Boiling Frog Dilemma. He's a colleague of mine at ATB Financial. Spiders in Space, Successfully Adapting to Unwanted Change. Now, why am I not supposed to be talking about this? Well, I do have a communications director who I work very closely with, and she said, don't talk about the book until we launch the book in April. So I'm not going to talk about the book. So just don't tell her I'm talking about the book. But the Spiders in Space book, the title of this book comes from, or I guess the metaphor comes from experiments that NASA did with spiders in space. The NASA scientists, they wanted to observe what will spiders do in zero gravity, especially around building their webs. Will they even try to build a web? Because on Earth, when a spider builds its web, the whole thing is dependent on gravity. The spider will lower itself down on its thread, but it uses gravity. The whole tension of the web is held in place with gravity. In space, at the International Space Station, suddenly the spiders had no gravity. So what are they going to do? Well, the spiders crawled out of their little tubes and they started floating around, and apparently they were a bit confused and disoriented at the beginning. And their first attempts at building webs, they got busy right away trying to build webs, but it wasn't working out for them at all. The webs were described as messy, disorganized affairs. But very quickly on, the spiders cracked the code. They figured out totally new techniques at building web that didn't require gravity. And I just thought this is the most amazing story. If the spiders were humans, the first thing the spiders would have done is form a committee, right? They would have had a task force of some sort, and they would have said, committee, go out and come up with some solutions. And the only solution that humans would have figured out is, well, we need those astronauts to bring us back to Earth, and we need them to do it right now. And here's the white paper, here's our solution, please bring us back. And if the astronauts had brought the spiders back to Earth, that actually would have been a good outcome for the spiders. But I guess to their credit, spiders don't overthink these things. They don't form committees. They just got on with doing what it is they do. They just had to figure out, how do we do it in this environment that's changed on us in a fundamental way? And the other piece of the metaphor that we love is that the spiders, they didn't have to morph into some creature that they are not. Spiders' DNA says, well, we spin web, we trap our food. And by the way, the astronauts, they did bring some flies up with them. But the DNA of the spider, they're trappers. They didn't have to change their DNA. They didn't have to change their story. They just had to figure out the way they executed their story in this environment that changed on them. So the spiders in space, there's 15 stories of what we call successful Canadian adapters from across the country, including Cape Breton. Yes, I understand. Yes, there's some Cape Bretoners there. Yeah. And the similar element in all of these stories, all of these spiders, they faced a sudden and unwanted change. But they all figured it out. They all cracked the code and found a successful way to adapt to it. And then in the second part of the book, we identify what are the common elements or the characteristics of those successful adapters. And we're careful to say this is not a how-to book. It's not 7 easy steps to adapting, because we really don't think adapting is easy. And we wouldn't be doing a good service if we said it's simple, follow these simple steps. It's not easy. It's really difficult. But we think that there are some common elements or some common characteristics of those that have been able to successfully adapt. So I'm not supposed to mention this either, but so I'm going to leave 3 copies to give out as door prizes tomorrow. Now, your chance of winning a book are low. However, your chance of buying a book from me later on are extremely high. So I'm going to stick around afterwards, and I'll if you're interested in picking up a book, they make excellent Mother's Day gifts and Father's Day gifts. This is the entrepreneur in me coming out. But with that, I do want to thank you very much for your kind attention. I've talked on far too long. Do we still have some time for some questions? We have time for questions, if there are any. Oh, this gal's got it. Okay. Oh, we got a microphone.
Oh, sorry. First of all, I would like to say, wow, you really do listen to your communications officer very effectively if you're not supposed to mention your book, Spiders in Space. Secondly, you mentioned there's a 2.2% growth in Alberta's economy. Given that this is a rural education symposium, do we have the breakout data for the growth in urban Alberta in relation to the growth in rural Alberta?
That's a great question. And actually, the short answer is no. We don't really break. Oh, I know, it's disappointing. Well, maybe you'll like my answer. Maybe you'll like my answer anyway. When I think about Alberta's macroeconomy, it's really difficult to think about urban versus rural because the whole thing is one integrated system in a lot of ways. It's true that a lot of people, if you live in urban Alberta or in rural Alberta, you might not travel or visit. But when you think about the energy sector, they're not drilling oil in downtown Calgary. They might be making some decisions there. But all of this happens in rural Alberta. Agriculture, it all happens in rural Alberta. Transportation, It all happens, you know. And then when we think about the public sectors, healthcare, education, this is uniform. So it's not that we're trying to be lazy and don't break it down. It's just that it's too difficult to say, well, this is urban growth and this is rural growth. It's sort of like talking about the non-peeing section of the swimming pool. It's a little gross, but it's all kind of, you know, it's one, you get the point, right? The metaphor is pretty clear. But it's all one system, so we don't break it down for that reason.
Yeah,
Yes.
so our Canadian dollar has been low for the last couple of years. It has helped out the price of farmers' commodities, which has helped them. Where is our dollar going?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And a lot of it, barring any like kind of wild, crazy changes south of the border, like a tariff wall goes up or something like that, I think the Canadian dollar will probably stay about where it's at, maybe drift a little bit higher, probably between 75 and 82 cents is my guess. But we don't know. If Donald Trump tweets out, "You too, Canada, you know, you're not exempt from this," and we see, for example, high tariffs on a new softwood lumber agreement or tariffs against agricultural products, we don't know precisely what's going to happen. So barring any wild change, I think modestly stronger Canadian dollar, but stay tuned for his tweets because it's just difficult to predict. But it's a great question. Yes?
My husband wants to invest his retirement savings into marijuana.
Oh.
And I keep saying no, and he's going, it's going to grow, it's going to... Like, who's right?
Wow. Marijuana. Well,
Like, I mean, you know, not to consume it, but to the company.
well, it's a great question. I have to preface this by saying I'm not an investment advisor, so I don't want to give bad investment advice. But, you know, when you look at medicinal marijuana, you know, and recreational marijuana, you can either look at these things in two ways, and my mother and I view them in different ways. I would view them as an economist. She would view, and it's a reasonable thing to do, but she would view marijuana, this is an ethical issue. And I would see this as, this is an economic and financial issue. And the two give you very different answers, you know, of what should happen. Regardless of what we might personally think, the ethics of it or whatever, we have strong indications that, you know, Canada is moving down the road to a more liberal market for marijuana. To me, I think that spells some investment opportunities. I really do. Exactly which ones, I don't know. I mean, it's possible to invest in a terribly run marijuana growing operation and lose all your money, but there might be some sound opportunities there too.
Mr. Hirsch, I'm
There we go.
I'm interested in your comments around interest rates because I take from your exchange rate answer that you're expecting the Canadian rates to at least track the American rates.
No, actually, I don't think Canadian interest rates will track U.S. interest rates at all. And that's one reason why the Canadian dollar is so soft. And it's not just me that thinks this. Markets have kind of priced in that the Bank of Canada is not going to move on interest rates for probably a year and a half or longer. Where they are pricing in that the U.S. Federal Reserve is likely to start raising rates again probably this month, March, or if not March, May. There's 3 rate increases expected south of the border this year. There's none expected in Canada. So as a result of that, this is one of the reasons why the Canadian dollar is at 74 cents and not at 94 cents. So I don't think we will see the Bank of Canada raise rates for, like I said, probably another year and a half or longer. There's just not really enough consistent inflation pressure. The last month's inflation report was strong, but that's only because natural gas and gasoline prices had jumped up. They're likely to fall back down. So the short answer is no, I don't think we'll see a rate increase in Canada, but we will in the U.S. Boy, that really took the wind out of the room in a hurry. Boy, if you ever want people to fall asleep, start talking about interest rates.
This is about in 1929, in the history of the States, they had a president come in and started putting a lot of tariffs on products coming in.
Yeah.
And it caused the Great Depression.
Yeah.
We're sort of lining up that way again with Trump. He's starting to tariff a lot of things, wants his country to grow great, but it's going to cause a slowdown in the world economy. So where's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was trained as an economist. I believe in liberal trade. I think there's things that you need to do to safeguard those most endangered by liberalized trade, but I don't think that's a reason to not do it. When you look at the experience of Canada, the United States with the free trade agreement, which is now almost 27 years old, you could not find a sensible economist that would say, on balance, that was a bad idea for both economies. Yes, there have been sectors, individuals, communities that have suffered, and I think we haven't done enough to help them. But I'm a liberal trader. So I think Donald Trump's approach to this is to blame America's problems, and especially those that are struggling. A lot of it is because, we were talking at our table, my estimation is they're struggling not because of a fundamental problem with their economy, it's a fundamental problem with their education system, that they have not, too many Americans have not, they've been robbed of a decent education. So you have two groups of people in the US, those who are upwardly mobile in a global economy, and they're going to do great. And then there's those who are kind of left behind in the global economy. And it's not their fault, but they are really angry about this, and they're voting for Donald Trump. And his only solution is, well, we're going to put up a tariff wall against those Chinese televisions. This isn't going to do anything positive for the job market for those individuals. It's not going to bring back those manufacturing jobs like he thinks, or maybe they think it's going to do. If anything, all this is going to do is US companies are saying, well, if we can't import televisions from China, we'll invest more factories in the United States, but it's going to be all automation and robotics. And it's not going to create manufacturing jobs. So I think it's a wrong-headed approach to it, but clearly the message is connected with millions of American voters who are really mad.
Todd, I have a question for you. Over here.
I have no directional. Oh, yeah, there we go.
One of the things that you mentioned was that the construction you thought was going to be down for the next year. Although at the throne speech, Lieutenant Governor Lois Mitchell read out that construction was going to be up because this is a good time to invest in instruction. And then they went on to talk about hospitals and schools, et cetera. So I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, and she's absolutely right. From the government's perspective, and it reinforces the notion that the government is intending to ramp up the public infrastructure spending on things like schools and hospitals and roads. That will be the nice offset, partial offset, to the downturn that we're going to see in private sector construction. So it's going to be a long time before another office building gets started in Calgary. We've got plenty of them. In Edmonton, not as severe a situation. And across the province, there's been a lot of commercial real estate. But what Lois Mitchell is talking about, the governor, lieutenant governor, is talking about is exactly right. The increase that we're going to see in public infrastructure spending, and she's right, it is a good time to spend on some of that. How we finance it, we can quibble with that, but it's a good time to be building, and that will provide a nice offset. So that's why I'm seeing a slowdown, but not a collapse. Yeah.
Just in the agriculture business and sectors, there's continual debate about a supply economy versus a market economy. And where do you think we're headed in Canada or Alberta? Because there's a lot of pressure down from the States that they go on the market economy versus what we do here.
Yeah, supply management in agriculture, it's a contentious issue. And it's one of those issues that it's not easy to solve. Most economists would say, well, we don't need them. We don't have supply management in, say, for example, beef, and we seem to do well in that sector. So why do we need it in chicken or eggs or, dairy? But I would say it's also not as easy as just saying get rid of it. There's a lot of work you'd have to do to unravel all of the implications with it, especially around the quota program. So even if you did get rid of it, you'd have to grandfather this in over a long period of time. It's my own personal sense, this is where I think it's moving toward. When we saw Stephen Harper, dismantle the Canadian Wheat Board, and we did not see a collapse in agriculture. I'm sure you can find farmers out there who are still mad about it, but it's hard to make a case that 5 years on that this has led to a tremendous hit to board grains like wheat and barley. So I think that's where it's all going. How we get there, it's political maneuvering. I think that they'd have to negotiate, most of it at the federal level, but I think that's where it's going. Okay, you get a second question. Oh, here comes the mic.
Thank you, Jackie. So currently, we're in curriculum development in the province of Alberta. So if you were asked as a panel expert to say, how would you guide the curriculum development expert working groups in terms of financial development for students in our K-12 or K to post-secondary system, what recommendations would you give us regarding that focus on curriculum?
Boy, that is a great question too. And it sounds like something a smarter expert than me should talk about, how to advise a curriculum development committee. And it's a huge question, it really is. Thoughts off the top of my head, when we think of financial literacy or maybe entrepreneurial literacy, I think this could be something that, rather than a standalone subject, like now we have a new, now here's entrepreneurialism, and tack it on as a new subject. If there's a way to infuse it into the curriculum so that there's a greater sense of an entrepreneurial thinking in all of the subjects that are taught. And by infusing it that way, you kind of make it part of the thinking process and the thinking pattern for students. I don't know if that's making any sense, and I'm not an educator, so again, I feel like I'm wading into very dangerous ground, because what do I know about it? But Alberta has always been an entrepreneurial place. Entrepreneurial attitudes are held in high esteem, and it really is true. I mean, this is a province, anything is possible. All you need is a positive attitude and a willingness to get involved and a solid education. But with that, there's lots of scope for entrepreneurial endeavors, and infusing that into a curriculum, if there's a way to do that, I think would be a smart way. With that, I'll answer the last question that you should have asked, and that is, they're $20. So I'm just gonna hang around here. But thank you so much for your very kind attention.
That's great. I'm going to take your words, Todd, okay? Well, wow, thank you so much, Todd. So interesting and so very engaging. You're a little wrong on your last point, being that when you say you're not an educator. Clearly this evening, I think in your presentation and your ability to answer these questions, you demonstrated all of the key qualities of being a very adept and an adaptive educator. So thank you so much for that. Your presentation was clear. It gave us a clear and concise snapshot of the Alberta economic scene across the many sectors that make up our economy. You certainly answered questions with a deep reflective and I'm sure well-researched background, and your presentation style was really, really engaging. So on behalf of the Alberta Rural Education Symposium, we do want to present you with a small token of our thanks, and we do want to say again, thank you so much for joining with us and engaging us this evening. So thank you so much. It's a great book about rural Alberta. It's a great book. Yeah. And we should get some contact.